Welcome to Block and Build, a podcast from Convergence Magazine. I'm your host and the publisher of Convergence, Caden Mock. On this show, we are building a roadmap for the movement that's working to block the ascent of authoritarianism while building the influence of a genuinely progressive trend in the broad front that we need to win. Before we get started, I want to thank our new Movement Builder level subscriber this week, Bob Wing. Convergence Magazine is an independent publication that relies on the generosity of our readers and listeners to create the rigorous and thoughtful takes that you've come to expect from us week in and week out. You can join Bob and become a subscriber at convergencemag.com/donate. Any amount helps, either as a one-time donation or a recurring monthly or annual subscription. This week on the show, I'm joined by political strategist Waleed Shahid to discuss the lay of the land that is the many, many hot takes and finger-pointing that's been going on since last week's election, both inside and outside of the Democratic Party. He recently laid out a really helpful typology on his Substack that we'll discuss, and we'll also talk about sort of what we need to sit with and digest, and also what we should just let roll off our backs. We'll also assess how the Uncommitted movement played out through this election season and where we go next to continue the important work of fighting for Palestinian safety and liberation. Then I am joined by Executive Director of Future Currents, Connie Raza, to talk about scenario planning and research work that they've been doing for the past year that can help us prepare in this treacherous moment. But first, some headlines. It's Trans Awareness Week, so I want to make you aware of two things. One is that oral arguments in the Supreme Court case, U.S. versus Skermeti, which is the equal protection case about Tennessee's blanket ban on trans health care for minors, will be heard on December 4th, just a few weeks away. The ACLU's Chase Strangio will be arguing for the equal protection side, and the organization is calling for a rally at the Supreme Court of trans people and our allies to show that trans people have popular support. Secondly, I'm trans. Now you're aware. Literally every time in the past week they've announced a new proposal for a cabinet position, all I can think is the nightmare blunt rotation continues. It's a real rogues gallery of the biggest assholes and demagogues in American politics. And really, if you think about it, the whole point of this is to raise your blood pressure and make you feel like doom is coming. So don't give them the satisfaction. When you see it, note it, and move on to what's next. All that said, some of this is the absolute most absurd shit I think I have ever seen, like, for example, the QAnon guy publicly auditioning for Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency on Twitter. It does in fact make my brain hurt, but I'm trying not to think about it too much. Something I am also thinking a lot about is H.R. 9495. Maybe you heard about this. This is a proposed bill that would give the executive branch the ability to revoke the tax-exempt status of any organization that they deem, quote, terrorist supporting. It went to a floor vote this past week, and it failed to meet the two-thirds threshold to pass the House. It did receive 256 yeas, 52 of which came from Democrats. It is likely to return to another vote. It is coming up through the House Committee on Rules for markup on Monday, and the way they're going to represent it will only require 50% plus one margin, making it likely to pass the House on its second go. Many of our regular listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with our first guest, Waleed Shahid. One of the co-founders of the Uncommitted movement, Waleed wrote the original memo that laid out the strategic framework for Listen to Michigan and other campaigns. Prior to that, he spent years with Justice Democrats, electing working class, progressive champions, and fighting for a Green New Deal. He's also, I think, one of the most earnest and clear-eyed strategists we have on the practical left. Welcome to Block and Build, Waleed.
Earnest and practical. So nice.
I like to gas up my guests a little bit, but really, like, we have a deep appreciation for the deep strategic insight that you bring to bear to a lot of the work that we desperately need to do right now.
Appreciate that. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. There's obviously a lot to talk about here, but the place that I actually want to start is the comments that you made to the New York City DSA chapter convention, which I found, they just hit exactly right for me, certainly. And, the reality of the situation around the amount of power that we've built, but then also thinking about, this refreshing sort of self-critique that I think that we need to be doing more of, honestly. And I think that the feelings that you talked about, the weight of the moment, and the weight of our failure as a movement, it just hit very deep for me. And I think that it's important for us to have a really sober assessment of the limits of the power that we have built. Could you lay out for our listeners a little bit of your argument and what you think are successes and failures as a movement thinking about Palestinian liberation in this period have been?
Yeah, part of part of my feeling of agitation to write that piece. I mean, when the DSA asked me to speak, they didn't really give me any like real guidance on what to say or what not to say, other than to comment on the moment and my thoughts about Uncommitted and the future of Palestinian human rights and how it relates to DSA. I actually was rewatching clips from the film How to Survive a Plague, which is a film about ACT UP, and there's a scene that you can find on YouTube of Larry Kramer, one of the, probably the most like visible spokesperson for ACT UP. He snaps at an internal meeting and talks about how they're losing. ACT UP is not winning. How the movement is splintering, blaming each other, and he just is kind of fed up with like the infighting. And I don't know. There was some. I would. Larry Kramer seems like I like. On the one hand, he's a hero. On the other hand, I would hate to be in a meeting with him.
Sure.
But I don't know. There was some sense of like, how do you make sense of a year of being unable to stop a genocide? And the closest thing I had to something in my like movement history is How to Survive a Plague. And yeah, I think what I wanted to share with the DSA was like things I hear a lot as someone who's in the kind of at a bridge between social movements and the Democratic Party and mainstream media. Like I hear a lot of criticism and feedback from people on the left and people in the like ecosystem of Democratic Party power. And those two spaces don't talk to each other a lot. And so I wanted to reflect what I was hearing back from a lot of people, my own experiences of working on things like Small Moments campaign in 2020 and Uncommitted. The main thing was that in some ways, the movement has been successful in moving public opinion. I think solidifying millennial and Gen Z consciousness around Palestinian rights, like that a majority of millennials and Gen Z are firmly, I think, against unconditional weapons funding for Israel, are sympathetic to the plight of Palestinians, are against war. But like that's not enough to have a solidified political majority in the country, and like public opinion also isn't enough on this issue. Like this is an issue dominated by essentially like a right-wing lobby, APAC and its affiliates, and they have like deep infrastructure, not just financially but also in political space. And like I think I've just been humbled by like not being able to move the needle in the Democratic Party of how deep and like broad and strong that infrastructure is amongst donors, amongst voters, amongst like kind of institutions in the party. And I wanted to like let DSA members know that like mobilizing more, mobilizing faster, making more incendiary statements is not going to be a path to power building. It does come back to organizing on some level and like building alliances across the Democratic Party ecosystem. And that like, I saw a protest at Hakeem Jeffrey's office in New York that had like 10 people at it, and I was like, what is the point of this? Like, might be worth your time to like meet with some black churches or Latino organizations in Hakeem's district to like start to build like more of a community organizing approach rather than just like yelling at Hakeem Jeffries, which we've been doing for a while and it hasn't changed much.
Yeah. I think that advice is super well taken, that like, my big takeaway from what you shared is also just that like there's a critical error in strategy and tactics, and that those things are not necessarily lining up in the face of people who have been like, people like the folks at APAC who have been thinking about this in a very like long term and like, what is the word? Sort of like strategically ruthless way for a very long time.
Shrewd? Is that
Yeah,
the word?
shrewd. Yeah. That they know what they're doing. They understand how power works in the Beltway. They understand how power works to get people inside the Beltway. So it seems like
Yeah, and I have these like anecdotes in the last like eight years of my like career of when Jamal Bowman ran for Congress, AIPAC sent a black outreach director to his district to organize black church leaders to go talk to Jamal Bowman about what the black community's issues are in the district, in which Israel was one of 5 issues they were going to talk about. And like that's organizing on some level.
Yeah.
And like I think, and I'm not discounting the financial and donor power that AIPAC has, but there is another side of it, which is there is like significant institutional and communal backing for AIPAC that I think some people on the left are don't understand or don't know, or I think the predominant worry about AIPAC is the amount of donor power they'll send at you, but they can mobilize like in-district community leaders too, and I think more people need to know that that's, in terms of what the left can do, that's a lot easier to do than getting a bunch of like rich people to donate to a pro-Palestinian PAC.
Totally, and that represents an opportunity for us, right? That like there's work to be done there. It's actually interesting. I just read this piece in N+1 this week about I think it was in their most recent issue, about the sort of like thinking about the attack on trans rights and identifying a sort of similar thing about like what Moms for Liberty can do versus what the sort of like pro-austerity, like anti-public education wing, like issue groups can do, that like those folks have the money, and then Moms for Liberty can like turn people out to like Board of Education meetings and whatever, and that like identifying some of that connection, that it's not just about money, that it is also about the right having organized people, and like recognizing where they're doing that actually seems like pretty critical to what our next steps are across issue area on the left.
Yeah, and I think like for the average DSA, like there was a lot of, I got a lot of support for what I said at DSA. I also received a lot of criticism, and I think like I can talk a lot about how AIPAC, what AIPAC's donor networks are, how like they raise money from the owner of the New England Patriots, who like is one of the richest people in America, Robert Kraft, and like. But for the average DSA member, there's not that much you can do about that. But there is something you can do in your community. And so I wanted to try to be, some people refer to what I wrote as Pollyannish, naive. And I do think like if we want to, if like there's a version of it that's like we can't do anything because they just have so much more money than the other side. But I don't think that helps us with organizing approaches, because then we just are going to do nothing and say it's a money issue, or we're going to do things that don't make sense, like sending 10 people, not that DSA did this, but like sending 10 people to protest at a member of Congress's office, which I don't think is like going to move the needle on this.
Yeah, and it is like at the end of the day, it's like absolutely unacceptable to do nothing, right? Like we need to be doing something, and we need to also be looking at like what we can do differently, and where there are levers that we can pull.
And I think in that setting, like people are expecting me to do 10 minutes dunking on AIPAC and dunking on Chuck Schumer, but like, what's the point? Like,
right. It's like we already know, right? Yeah, totally. It's like we already know what the problem is with the opposition.
Yeah.
Well, I think the other thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit with you, not as like a blame game thing, but I think to this organizing question and I would say like gaps in our community organizing are the ways that you were lifting up some of the ways the right was trying to demobilize or even mobilize Arab and Muslim communities, especially in Michigan, for Trump, right? And I think that, anecdotally, I'd also heard from folks that I know. I grew up in Michigan, so I've folks there, that some of that messaging, unfortunately, seemed deeply resonant to a lot of people. I definitely obviously don't want to lay blame with individual voters for making the choices that they made, because like I think the problem is that like there was an organizing gap there that made that feel compelling to people. And like, some of this is a Democratic Party issue, but I'm interested to hear from you what you think about that messaging and the impact that it had now post-election day. I think the text messages that you shared on your Substack were like very chilling, to be honest, in terms of making. I mean, this is also part of this weird thing about making the case for Trump as a peace candidate, which I feel like has been popping up all over the place, which is frankly baffling to me. But Seriously. I guess you can say whatever you want.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm wondering what you're thinking about that post-election.
So a couple of things. One, before October 7th, in Michigan, what I was told by several people in the Dearborn area is that the Michigan Republican Party was going into Arab and Muslim civic institutions and religious institutions and doing the Christopher Rufo playbook of getting people to be scared of what liberals were doing at their schools. For those who don't know, Christopher Rufo is a conservative operative at the Heritage Foundation. He famously came up with if people remember, one of the biggest debates in the year 2004 was that we were teaching evolution in our schools as opposed to intelligent design. That's Christopher Rufo. In 2021, it was critical race theory is being taught in our schools, and then in 2023, it became the LGBTQ friendly curriculum in schools. I don't like the great men of history theory, but Rufo is it's like a good character study of conservative operatives are building these campaigns and deploying them. And so Michigan Republican Party was going into Arab and Muslim communities, and the critical race theory stuff wasn't going to work on Arabs and Muslims, but the LGBT stuff was. And, they mobilized people to go to the school board, yell at the school board people about trans-inclusive and, queer-inclusive curriculum. They protested and pressured the mayor on it. The mayor didn't budge on removing the books. And then October 7th happened. And so you had a ripening of conditions of people being organized into the Republican framework and away from the Democratic framework. And then you had the deepest sense of betrayal from the Democratic Party ever experienced by this community. This is a community that has consistently voted Democrat for a long time, since probably 2004. Or 2002, and a lot of UAW history in these communities. And when October 7th happened, I think people were expecting more engagement from their Democratic representatives, but Governor Whitmer, Senator Peters, didn't. It took them months, if anything, to show up in the communities and even start to engage with people. This is a community of probably the largest Lebanese American community in the country, and many Palestinian Americans, people who've had loved ones killed by U.S. supplied bombs in Israel over the past year, especially with the escalation in Lebanon. People are having funerals for loved ones who live in Lebanon in Dearborn and Hamtramck. And so, I think this is a part of the story, is that this is a community we've heard in the Black community and Latino community, that the Democratic Party has taken these voters for granted, believing they would vote Democrat solely based on scaring them about how dangerous Trump is and how racist Trump is. And so what was left was a vacuum that was filled by Republican culture war nonsense, and then a deep betrayal of feeling seen, feeling recognized, being seen as equally human by the party, and then a series of failures by the Trump visited Dearborn and Hamtramck multiple times in person, talked about how he was going to end the wars and bring peace to the Middle East, criticized Harris for being a warmonger and standing with Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney, and Harris didn't visit Dearborn once in this past year. And so part of the Uncommitted campaign was warning that this was going to happen back in February. We were hey, we also want to defeat Trump, and you are already losing a lot of people. Please, we're trying to make you take this as seriously as possible. And I think many, many, many more people would have voted Republican or Jill Stein or not voted at all if it wasn't for the Uncommitted campaign. But Yeah, I think it's one of those things where like there was a vacuum of leadership and it was filled by a far right authoritarian who was promising you um, lies and like preying on your
Hmm.
despair. And I feel sad mostly for the communities that were lied to. And like now you see
Yeah.
with the cabinet appointments, like he is appointing the most anti-Palestinian people in the United
Yeah.
States.
Yeah, I think that the like it is, I don't know. It is just really it's just really fucking sad that like, and it's not a lesson that we needed to learn in this way, right? That like when there are gaps in our organizing and our landscape, like as the broad left, I'm not even saying that this is like on our movements, but this is on like, you know, the much broader front that is like, hey, a Trump presidency is not going to be good news for most people. Um, that like there are just so many opportunities to intervene on this that would have really not taken much. It seems
No,
like.
the uncommitted movement, like the asks we've made, besides an arms embargo, there were other asks we made along the way that we thought could help the campaign
Yeah.
in its effort to defeat Trump. Having a speaker at the DNC who was Palestinian, making a statement about what Harris would do differently on Palestine as compared to Trump. Um, what like a statement saying Harris intended to uphold domestic and international law as it pertained to the use of weapons abroad, meeting with families either publicly or privately in Michigan who've been impacted by Israel's bombings. Like there were so many things just to make people feel seen, and like Trump made people feel seen. Like he showed up, he listened to them, he told them what they wanted to hear, and it wasn't that hard. It didn't
Yeah.
need to be that hard.
Yeah, and didn't need to be like even like hugely necessarily effortful on the campaign's part. It seems like.
You know,
Well, I mean, this also in some ways is like maybe a good segue to talking about this Substack post that you did, I think earlier this week. There was sort of this typology of responses to the election that I found really helpful because it was also like, here's an emblematic commentator who's like saying this thing. I've been sending it around to a lot of people who are like trying to make sense of the sort of like commentary. And I'm wondering, like, having written that and also thinking about these organizing gaps, by your lights, what do you think are the most useful threads of commentary that you've seen that you really want to lift up for movement folks to chew on further and think about as we build strategy going forward?
so one of the biggest threads that I think is a useful conversation amongst the left is the question around Bidenomics.
Mm.
There's a deep debate happening in the Democratic Party on Twitter and Substack on TV about was there anything Joe Biden could have done or Kamala Harris could have said to actually get people to be convinced that they were going to solve inflation and the cost of living crisis. Um, Biden, like, there's basically a debate happening that Biden did do a lot on the economy and talked a lot about the economy and talked a lot about inflation. And Harris, most of her campaign ads were about price gouging and inflation. Biden spent more money than any Democratic president has since LBJ. And I think there are people who feel like one, he either overspent money, two, and that caused more inflation to happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Two, that he didn't communicate the wins, or the wins weren't going to be visible until 2025 or 2026 about what he actually was doing on the economy. Three, some of the things like the child tax credit expired,
Right.
and like some of the COVID policies didn't hold over. And then four, it's like a um, the policies weren't big enough or tangible enough for people to feel like this addressed issues like groceries or rent or healthcare in a tangible way. My anecdotal experience of like working class people in my life and like non-college voters in my life is they cannot name one thing that Biden and Harris did in the past 4 years to help with the cost of living. And I like so it's frustrating to me to have this like intellectual debate about economic policy, what Biden did or what Biden didn't do. Like he did spend billions of dollars on clean energy and on COVID recovery, but it's 2024 and people aren't like, there aren't quick answers to these questions. And like I've talked to so many people who have been like, yeah, what have they done? I don't, and I hear from a lot of people in Democratic Party and progressive economic world, like they're starting to list all the things that Harris said she was going to do or Biden was going to do, but it really did not trickle down to voters. And so I think that's one piece of the debate that is like interesting on like the substantive policy level and the communications level is like what happened on the economy and what happened in the last 4 years of Biden. And then this leads to my second point, which is if voters don't feel like you are addressing their number one issue, which is the economy, and you have not, like, Chris Hayes refers to this as the war on attention. A lot of people have referred to this concept as like we live in an attention economy. Like, we did not win the war of attention on the economy or on any issue. Democrats this time around. And so if you're not going to win the war of attention, then like bullshit is going to fill the vacuum and empty promises of change. And so what filled the vacuum? The border, asylum seekers,
trans people,
the millions of trans people who want to play sports around the country. The number
God
one
forbid,
issue,
you know, like
the hundreds of millions of trans Americans who want to play volleyball, and yeah, and like then like Trump's kind of nonsense around how he'll change, like just the change stuff. And I think this is also the second conversation I think is really important is around this question of economics versus culture war. And I've been frustrated. I mean, it's a similar, I feel extremely nauseated by how similar this feels to 2016, 2017. I'm like, I have had these arguments and debates already once before, and we're doing it again. But like one of the things I tried to write in the Substack is like we are as a country going through societal changes on family, on gender, on sexuality, on race, on migration, on climate change. Like there are changes happening in our society, and voters aren't dumb. And Democrats are like, they have kind of a couple ways of going about these cultural changes happening in our country, which is one, they're trying to distract you. Don't worry about that.
Right.
Or two, yeah, like these cultural changes are bad. I agree. or three, like, you know, the kind of liberal elite version, which is like, you're dumb if you don't know what they, them pronouns are, if you don't know how to use them. So is like, to me, I haven't seen much commentary or analysis about like, like it seems like queer Americans and immigrants are not going to go away anytime soon. And so like how can we get better about inoculating for what is going to always happen with right-wing politics or fascist politics, which is to go after minorities and marginalized communities and like make you feel like they're destroying your country and your like way of life. And so I don't know, I think a lot of Democrats are burying their heads in the sand that they can continue to just like, I don't know. My mom is someone who is like pretty like conservative culturally on a lot of these issues, and the only people that she hears from about transgender Americans is the right wing, and like maybe a little bit from like Hollywood, but like she doesn't hear that much from. It's not like Democrats campaign on that stuff. They like leave the field open. So that's kind of, I see my mom is like, all I hear is that they're teaching kids about this in schools, and I think that's weird.
Right, and I think that I feel this way about the like, especially the sort of conjunction of the climate and migration conversations too, that like the people who are like finding a way to talk about how climate is changing and also may drive migration is something that like I don't think anybody has actually solved for outside of a sort of like more academic, intellectual, like we have an analysis of this that like drives what we think should happen, but we don't have a way of communicating about it to like regular ass people to be like, this is what is happening in the world, and that's really
And
troubling.
it's naive to think this is gonna stay with us for our whole lives.
Yeah, forever, actually.
Yeah, and I don't know. I went through some of the takes after 2004 when John Kerry lost to George W. Bush, and Dianne Feinstein of San Francisco, California, said that legalizing same-sex marriage in San Francisco helped the Republicans beat John Kerry because it scared the middle voter. And so I'm like, yeah, we've been here before.
Yeah.
This isn't that different from every conversation we've had as a country around dismantling some hierarchies of oppression that probably shouldn't exist. There's always going to be oh, maybe we move too fast on that. And I'm like, yeah, the problem isn't we move too fast. The problem is we're moving. And
Yes.
and so how do we deal with the moving that's happening?
Yeah. And how do we make the moving make sense to people who?
Totally. I mean, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who is involved in the LGBT rights stuff, and she was like, there in philanthropy, there's not very much interest in raising the sale, and this is true of not just trans rights but also migration. There is not interest in raising the salience of these issues in the national conversation for fear of electoral and political backlash, and that is what we witnessed this past election, was a deep fear of trying to make a persuasive case or even humanize or contextualize migrants and trans Americans on a national level so that people could understand what the fuck is happening and why Republicans are trying to exploit this issue.
Yeah.
I think we really just left a vacuum that was filled by the far right.
And it's actually a vacuum that the far right is specifically designed to be able to fill, right? That
Yeah.
This is the Steve Bannon flood the zone with shit thing, right?
Totally,
That
yeah.
they don't even care if what they're saying is true or accurate or a reflection of something that exists. They just have to say something. They know they have to say something, and that can be demobilizing and demoralizing.
How does your shit dominate the conversation?
Yeah.
It's and so I don't know. I'm so the economy, this kind of culture war economics thing, and then the third piece is democracy. Democrats did again try to run a campaign about democracy, and we live in a country where Joe Manchin has shown us for the past 4 years that democracy doesn't it's not a democracy, and nobody buys that. And if people don't feel like the democracy is working for them, and they would rather take a chance on an authoritarian strongman who is saying that I will fix things and I'll get rid of the gridlock and I'll end the wars, I'll bring peace to Ukraine, I'll bring peace to the Middle East, just trust me, I'll do it. And we need, if Democrats are going to be the party of democracy, you can't sell you can't sell democracy, you have to sell the Anat Shenker-Osorio says this thing, you can't sell the recipe, you have to sell the cake.
That's right.
And we need, what does democracy do for people? Is it working?
Mm-hmm.
Is it delivering things? There's a Spanish leftist who has a quote where the central premise of democracy is a challenge to feudalism, which is we should take the power and money that the feudal lords have and spread it with everybody else. That's what democracy is supposed to be, and I don't think that's not the system we have today. And
No.
so yeah, I just we did not show that democracy deserved to be the selling point of this candidate this time around. And and it's partly not just the fault of Democrats. We have a fucked up system in which it's really hard to get things done in Congress.
Yeah.
And so, but it's another one of these things that will last with us for a while, is just how do we, in a context where our Congress is gridlocked almost all the time, how do we have a vision that doesn't lead itself to be easy fodder for the authoritarian right to be yeah, this stuff doesn't work.
Totally. Well, it's also, this thing that you're saying about making the case for democracy not working, resonates deeply also when you think about the ballot initiative landscape this year.
Yeah.
But also as a Californian, thinking about the ballot initiative landscape here and how like that process is already being sort of bought off in the like through the extreme wealth inequality that we have in this state, right? That like
Yeah.
basically Silicon Valley money is like able to pay for ballot initiatives to pass or fail.
Yeah.
And so like I think the outlook feels really dire on making democracy make sense to people. And so like I think that there's an interesting opportunity that we have to maybe say something positive and visionary about how we would like democracy to work in this moment that I'm not seeing a lot of and I would like to see more of.
Yeah. Yeah, that all makes sense. I think if there's one hot take, the hottest take, the best take is that Kamala Harris was asked multiple times, how will you be different from Joe Biden? And she said, I won't. And so if there's anything to blame for the election, it's clearly the woke mob that made her say that multiple times.
Well, and also like what a leading question, right? Like we're
I
asking
know,
you
but
how
like, but Caden, she could have said a million things. She could have said,
million
I'll have a cat instead of a dog. I'll prioritize childcare in my first 100 days. My first executive order will be XYZ. Like,
yeah, it could have been anything, really.
it could have been anything except nothing, except what she said, which was
Literally nothing.
Like I'm not even saying she needed to say like I'll do Medicare for all or free Palestine. She just needed to say anything.
Anything. Yeah, like bring that child tax credit back. I think people would have gone nuts for that.
The bar was very low.
The bar was in hell.
Sad.
Is there anything else? Is there anything
How
else
did we lose to these people?
Bro, it's like I said, the bar's in hell. Waleed, I do really appreciate your insight. I appreciate all your work. Thank you so much for making the time to chat. It's a rough time. It's a dark time. What is there anything that you are looking forward to? I mean, that's a good question. Is there stuff that's like on your radar that you're like, okay, here's a bright spot?
There's a lot of good music that came out in the first Trump term. The bright spot. What bright spots are there? I don't know. This isn't a bright spot. This is like a horizon that I think will be interesting. Is we are entering a political era in the Democratic Party where Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, or the Clintons, are not going to be the dominant factor in the future of the Democratic Party debate. Like Biden was Obama's vice president.
Sure.
Obviously, Hillary Clinton was in Obama's administration, Bill Clinton. And like, I love Bernie Sanders, but he's getting old. And so like, what does the future of the party and the future of the progressive wing look like in this completely new era where I don't think it'll look like 2016 to 2020 where it was like kind of the Bernie and AOC like show. I think it'll, obviously AOC is still a major figure and the squad's a major figure, but like it will be so, it's hard to predict what will happen. And like, nobody could predict that Barack Obama was going to emerge from the Kerry loss to become the Democratic Party nominee in 2008. Like, all the takes in 2004 was that the party was seen as weak on terrorism, weak amongst Christian men, and like too close to same-sex marriage. And Obama was like a liberal critic of the Iraq War, left of Hillary Clinton, and a black man whose middle name was Hussein. Like, we don't, like 4 years from now, like it could go any direction. But I do think it's like, have we prepared the infrastructure and organizing forces to like wage this next phase of battle? Because there is, as people know, there is a backlash to the left on economics, on culture, on race, like much more than there was in 2016 after Hillary lost. Like, so there, we are on the big kid stage. And that's the next 4 years.
Totally. Yeah. No, I think you're right. The party as terrain of struggle frame is going to be interesting for all of us in this next period. So,
Rahm Emanuel, DNC chair. I don't know if you saw that.
I did not see that.
Oh yeah, he's
Oh boy.
3 sources close to Rahm Emanuel say he's considering a run for DNC chair.
All right. Well, it's one thing I will say is it's not going to be boring.
Good for the CNN executives.
Oh God. Waleed, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for making
Thank
the
you.
time, and we'll talk to you soon, I'm sure.
Be a long 4 years. So I'll be here.
All right, take it easy,
Bye.
man. Well, people obviously right now are working through some really complicated feelings about last week's election results and what it means for the future. There's other folks who've been planning for this outcome, and also how we as individuals and movement organizations can respond. We have some resources up at convergencemag.com, including this great piece from Daniel Hunter that maybe you've seen making the rounds, 10 ways to be prepared and grounded now that Trump has won. And my next guest has also been exploring this scenario with a broad range of organizations. Her group is called Future Currents, and they have a new report out called Getting Ready and Staying Ready, Lessons from the 2025 and 2026 Scenario Exercises, which summarize nearly a year of scenario planning with folks across the country, different movement organizations at different geographies and scales, and is really a great resource as we move into this uncertain future. Take a listen to our conversation. Is a group that builds with movement organizations and grassroots groups to support research, scenario planning, and strategy design. Connie Raza, Executive Director of Future Currents, joins me today to talk about the scenario planning and research work that they have done to support preparedness in this treacherous time. Thank you so much for making the time to talk, Connie.
Thank you for having me here.
Awesome. Well, to start out, I love a little methodology talk. So I'm really curious about how your team approached the long process of scenario planning that's reflected in the top lines of your most recent pre-election report. How do you all approach this work, and what's the experience that's kind of informed this approach?
Awesome. Thank you. So we also are kind of methodology nerds. And one of the key pieces that we're interested in is how do we help folks hold a longer time horizon than they ordinarily do and can in their day-to-day work without imagining that we are accurately predicting the future. So what we really spent a lot of time with was what are the signals, trends, the facts of life today that give us some inkling of where we might be headed. What are people saying, but also what are they doing? What is policy currently leading us to, and what are some of the shifts that we could imagine in different outcomes? Then really we wanted to think about how do we tee up a tool for movement organizations and leaders to be able to be as prepared and nimble to meet the future conditions as possible. Which conditions did we need to focus on? And that helped us really hone in on what are the trajectories that we were looking at. And then develop kind of, for this particular scenario, we really wanted to develop pretty immersive scenarios for what the life in 2026 would look like in different election outcomes, so that we could then work backward to what did it look like in 25, how did the election go in the immediate post-election, in order to be able to really dig in on that question of what do we need to be prepared to do? What work are we doing now that we need to amp up? What do we need to pull back on? What do we need to add in? Who do we need to be in relationship to in order to be ready to meet the range of conditions that we might be facing?
Yeah, that seems really powerful. And I think that, a lot of the scenario planning that I've seen recently and I've been a part of recently has been useful for this sort of immediate period, but taking that longer time horizon I think can be very challenging, and it's especially challenging now as we're sort of facing down the situation that we see right now. I'm interested in, I guess, knowing that, how game are folks to work through those longer time horizons? And like, do you, you know, how, like, are people ready to kind of take that stance? And like, what kind of preparation is necessary to get people there?
Totally. I think that it might make sense for me to give a little bit of background on future currents, because I think that it actually answers this question of how prepared people were to look forward, even as they were actually getting ready for the election and their work of that period and dealing with all of the ups and downs of the months leading up to today. So future currents really grew out of some responses to 2016, that election, when folks had planned for one outcome and not for another, and then found themselves in a really radically different future that they weren't prepared for. And a set of organizations came together and were like, we need scenario planning as a real muscle that we can exercise, and really piloted what would become future currents. And so through the work with those organizations for the midterms in 2018, for the census and the elections in 2020, we became sort of like a broader movement utility. And we've been doing scenario planning that whole time. So one of the things that we found was that there was much greater appetite for scenario planning heading into this election than we were even expecting. And part of that is because it's been really socialized, I think, throughout the movement ecosystem. I would even say, like, in addition to the work that we did, there was scenario planning that others did with their organizations that meant that our field has been really robustly prepared in a range of ways and different modalities even of scenario planning. So ours was very immersive. There are some that are much more like tabletop exercises that are more kind of like quick scenarios that you really grapple with in groups. Some are like role-playing games and that kind of thing, but that really help to get different almost like mini ecosystems, like prepared for what was to come. So that was exciting. I think that the other piece that was really heartening is that we were really aiming at looking beyond the election as opposed to preparing for the election itself. And there was a great appetite for being ready for whatever the conditions of government were going to be on the other side. And like, frankly, I think that we need even more of that. In the condition that we find ourselves in, Trump has been elected. Every branch of federal government is in the control of folks who would abuse their power over and don't really have any interest in power with. And so
that's a very diplomatic way of describing it. Yes.
And so I think that and it has been so heartening to see the preparation to dig into how we resist the kinds of abuses of power that they're going to attempt. And I believe that we also need to keep our eyes on our prize, keep our eyes looking forward and anchor to the just and joyful world that we all are working for, and guide our sort of our path through this treacherous terrain to that. And so how we hold both of those timelines and both of those kind of dispositions. I mean, it is in your name, Black and Build.
Right.
And I just think it's like critical right now.
Yeah, I think that's quite right, and I am also very reassured by the like level of hunger people have for these conversations. And I think that also like some of the conversations that we were having on this show pre-election also kind of bear that out around people's analysis around the sort of like dangers actually presented by the tack to the right that is happening across party lines, right?
Yes.
That like whether that's backlash against the pro-Palestine movement or whatever, or like the backlash against like rights for trans people, that like that is a bipartisan consensus apparently that is not shared by actually a huge number of people in the country. And so knowing that is like knowing that are not going to necessarily have friends in high places in either case seems like it really has been a big piece of the puzzle here. I would guess.
Yeah, I mean, I would not have wanted us to find ourselves in the condition that we're in right now.
No.
And one thing that has occurred to me is that there has been a lot of trying to figure out how to preserve some of what we have and kind of tack our way to the goal that we have of a radically inclusive, robust, and reparative democracy. And with kind of like a power structure that is clearly in power and clearly opposed to democracy, like I think that it opens up our creativity about how we accomplish the beautiful democracy that we mean to build, and how we show up for one another and approach with open arms, as well as sort of like the strong defense that we need, feels to me like an opportunity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this also makes me think a lot about something that I feel like I've learned a lot about this year around scenario planning, and that I think is often overlooked, is the emotional part of scenario planning. A lot of people, probably everybody listening to this podcast, and certainly for myself, that a lot of us are sitting in some very unpleasant feelings right now. And, a lot does remain uncertain. That, if our experience bears anything out, is that there's a lot that we are still learning about what things are going to look like. And it's also not clear how certain parts of the ecosystem are going to respond to conditions. And that uncertainty is just going to continue for months to come. What can you tell us about what you learned about cultivating emotional resilience and preparedness through this process that gave rise to this report?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I think through the scenario planning that we did this year, as well as in 2020 and 22, we really learned to foreground the kind of emotional inoculation of scenario planning. And it has borne fruit. I mean, I will say that for myself, having been the person who was sort of presenting the Trump scenario for months, on Wednesday of last week, when we got the final results that Trump had won, and the indication that he was winning the popular vote as well, I found that I was already in a kind of like, okay, well, the work begins, let's go, kind of stance, which isn't to say that I wasn't also sort of like processing like deep anxiety, worry, disappointment, anger, sadness at the same time. But like, I also was familiar with this outcome and was thinking about, okay, so what does this mean? Like, how do we move forward? And I think it is not that it completely obliterates the emotions of the moment, but it does allow for resilience is a great word, a like being able to move in the even as we're holding those emotions.
Yeah. I think I think similarly that like I've, been gaming out things by myself. We've been talking about them a little internally as an organization. And that similarly, it's not that I didn't have those dreadful feelings, and especially like I went to a gathering on election night with like a bunch of other movement people, and people were looking a little listless pretty early on. And it's not that I didn't feel those things, but I think that like my own, I also feel like I can see my way through some of the fog in a different way because of that, which feels really important.
Yeah, totally. As you're saying that, I mean, it's making me think of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds. You know what I mean? Like, is there, as we're sort of heading into the future, I just do wonder if there's like a way of like a kind of mass inoculation or something that isn't setting people up for a feeling of the inevitability of it. Because
Sure.
the point of scenario planning is we are facing some conditions that are outside of our control. And how do we take action in the face of them? And that's the piece, is that it's like not just sort of like familiarity with it, but being on the front foot a little bit more in the face of these conditions that are pretty harsh.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of like, in addition to my sort of like work here, hosting the show, running the magazine, I do plenty of listening in my own like small listening in my personal social networks about like what are people talking about, how are people feeling, and like one of the things that I do already see from I think people in my network who might identify more as liberal as opposed to like movement people is that sort of like creeping sense of inevitability of certain things that I think is really demobilizing. And yeah, I think, well, in some ways, this is a good segue to my next question, which is about lifting up some of the insights that you all gleaned on the build front in the current scenario that we're in. I think it's really important and probably like a helpful thing for a lot of people to hear. And there are two things that I'll highlight, and I'm curious for you to unpack, or if there's other things you want to highlight too. One is the building that can happen between movement groups and formations. So deepening the bonds of trust and collaboration. And not only is there an urgent need for that, right, in this moment where we need to keep each other safe, that there is strength in numbers, especially when you think about, what happened around the Muslim ban and the airport mobilizations in 2017, and like what that looked like for people. And then the other piece is about local and regional opportunities to what the report describes as leapfrog forward, and how to be ready for those opportunities. I live in Oakland, and the city attorney of San Francisco has already come out to say this, and Rob Bonta, the attorney general of California, has already come out and said, like, we're ready to fight. Like we're ready to throw down using the tools that are available to us. And often those kinds of folks are the opponents of some of our work as movements. But in this moment, we may be part of a broader front together. And there may be some willingness at the state level in some places, and even in the county and municipal level in some places, to fight the good fight right now. And how can we be ready for those kinds of scenarios and seize those opportunities when they present themselves? So I'm curious if you could unpack some of the insights around those two things, and also if there are other things on the sort of like build front that you think people might be excited to hear about.
Totally. So I do think that there is like harsh conditions are fertile conditions for building coalition and solidarity. And a couple of things that I would say about it. One, I feel like we sometimes get seduced by the possibility that we can win our thing and sort of break ranks in order to try and go after that thing. And whether that's like, I think that it is maybe likely that it won't be with this administration, but even if there's a possibility of winning in 2028, for instance, a more affirming governing scenario, like it's actually critical for us to remember what we are learning right now that we had learned already before, which is that the march of authoritarianism is a long march. It is not only when there is a clear pro-authoritarian force in place. It is also in between, and we have to hold together. And so practicing now what comes more easily in the face of such harsh conditions, we also need to keep the long view and hold together, even when there are opportunities for us to advance some pieces. And I think that part of that is like being strategic about it might not be my fight is the one that's up. But if we are helping people to see how our worldview of taking care of one another, of providing for communities, of putting people and communities first, if we're able to show people in action our vision, that is a win. And that can be through like legislation, in the future, but it also is how we act together now. So that holding that practice today for the long view feels to me really important. The second is, and this maybe is like skewing away from the build, but I actually don't think it is we have to protect each other. We are going to be under attack, and the way that the attack is going to come is going to be bit by bit. It's not going to be all of us all at once, but when our Palestinian, Muslim, Arab brothers and sisters are under attack, when our anti-war, pro-Palestinian activist friends are under attack, we have to stand up for them. We have to stand up for them. And we have to do it when the mass deportations begin, in whatever way they begin. We have to stand up with our immigrant brothers and sisters and the people who are being profiled in an expansive way. And it means that our organizations have to do it, we as individuals have to do it, and philanthropy has to do it. We have to have a hard line that says that talking about democracy is still C3 activity. Like we're allowed to do
Yes.
it.
Look.
And so like being clear about that, it is a block move, but it's also a build move. And so it also means that when we see that the folks who think that they are going to get provided for by an administration that doesn't care about working and poor people, that we also have to stand up for them and invite them in to our worldview. We take care of each other. So that's the build part. The leapfrogging question is so exciting to me, and I'm going to start in a place that is different from where you want me to start, which is I'm going to start with the states that have authoritarian governments already.
Yeah.
And I'm going to start there because they have shown us what it looks like to build power in a hostile environment and to actually win some stuff, even in the face of authoritarianism, to move people, to bring people together, to be able to actually make advances and build power. And so I think that those of us who don't live in authoritarian states have a ton to learn from them. And we need to make sure that they continue to have the resources that they need and that we are working all together in that way. And then there are opportunities in states that have progressive governments that want to demonstrate that they do not stand with or for authoritarian overreach, that they are for the principles of democracy that say we are here to take care of one another, to make decisions together, to respect one another, and that in a hostile federal environment, we may be able to leapfrog over the goals that we had set for ourselves in our states and our cities and accomplish even more and be even brighter beacons of what democracy can look like and what it can deliver for our folks, and our folks being a really expansive descriptor.
Yeah, yeah. No, I also find that personally helpful because I think one of the other things that has been like incredibly upsetting about the election results here in California are the sort of like the failure of a lot of like progressive ballot measures here, the recalls of progressive DAs, mayors, things like that, that like they don't feel like they portend well, but also that like this is a live fight. Like these are things that I think there's only so much looking backward at what happened that's going to tell us about what comes next in terms of some of that kind of thing. That like we are in some uncharted territory in some ways around creating progressive policy in states like California, and that like there are still opportunities. And that they are opportunities that are informed by the larger national political climate.
Totally. I also, I've been thinking a lot about the lessons that we can learn, not just from like our friends in authoritarian states, but from other places that have faced authoritarian governments and the folks who study them. I don't really study them. But one of the things that has stuck with me has been Maria Stefan from the Horizons Project has said a ton, and I know it's not just her. I feel like I'm also hearing Rachel Brown from Over Zero in my head and Scott Nakagawa. So that mostly people don't approve of political violence, and if we are able to help interpret what is happening for folks, they will revolt against it. They will resist it, and it will cause a backlash. And I think that actually our disposition in resistance needs to be, how are we helping people to make meaning of what is coming, the onslaught, and it is an onslaught, and how we can take action together to resist it and make it backfire. And so I know they talk about it in the political violence context, but I do think that it is like a really helpful disposition because it is communitarian and it is it helps us move out of a kind of despairing of the inevitability of this and into a proactive stance around it. So,
yeah, I also hear there too that there's like there's like an ecosystem task, right? That is about like there's not any one formation or organizational form that can solve this alone, and that in fact like the relationship between organizations like Future Currents, organizations like a big labor union, say SEIU or the UAW, organizations like local people's organizations or mutual aid organizations, movement media organizations.
Yeah.
That like it is going to take all of us to make sense of what happens for people in ways that like encourage protagonism and encourage people to like see themselves as part of really a like activated majority that is trying to make the world a more livable place for all of us.
100%. And opportunities for people who might not ever be a part of any of those organizations to participate in that activation. Yeah, totally.
That's amazing. I feel like I got a lot out of reading and like spending some time with the report that you all did on the scenario planning that you've done. I'm curious how our listeners can keep up with your work and find out more about what you've been studying.
Totally. So we are working on getting a website, but we don't have one right now. So they can email us at info@futurecurrents.org.
Great. I'm sure you'll be getting some emails from some listeners who want to see more about what's been going on.
Awesome.
Is there anything else you want to leave us with? Any other learnings that you want to uplift?
I think the one thing that I would say is I have really been resourcing my heart with the fact that we have gotten through authoritarianism on the federal level before. Like, the history of this country has been a history of taking an exclusive idea of democracy that is in fact authoritarian for most people and expanding it. And we're in the midst of a backlash to that, but we have done this, and we've got this, and we've got each other. And I don't at all mean to discount how hard it's going to be, but I feel so resourced by knowing that and knowing that we're in it together, and by the communities that are coming together that exist, that like you all have been nurturing, that organizers have been nurturing, that we live in and nurture in our lives. And so that's the one thing that I feel like we didn't cover that I would say.
Yeah. No, on a call last week, a friend of mine said that we are different people than we were in 2016 in a lot of really important ways, and that's actually good, right? Like, we've evolved also as individuals and changed and adapted to the conditions that we faced. And there's a lot of processing of those changes that I actually think that we need to do more of in public. And that, like, I think in the coming months we're going to be doing on this show. So, yeah, thank you so much, Connie. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
It's been a total pleasure here too. Thank you so much.
My thanks again to Waleed Shahid and Connie Raza for joining me this week, and my thanks to all of you for sticking with us. You can find links to connect with them and their work in the show notes, including a link to Waleed's Substack, a link to Future Currents' report on scenario planning. This show was published by Convergence, a magazine for radical insights. I'm Caden Mock, and our producer is Josh Elstro. If you have something to say, as always, you can drop me a line. Send me an email that we will consider running on an upcoming mailbag episode at mailbag@convergencemag.com. And if you'd like to support the work that we do at Convergence, bringing our movements together to strategize, struggle, and win in this crucial historical moment, you can become a member at convergencemag.com/donate. Even a few bucks a month goes a long way to making sure our independent small team can continue to build a map for our movements. I hope this helps.